Welcome to the AI and Faith podcast. We are a community of expert technologists, professionals, and faith leaders bringing the ancient wisdom of the world's major religions to the ethics of artificial intelligence. Join us on this new journey and welcome to the conversation.
Welcome. My name is Gilad Berenstein, and thank you for joining us for another episode of the AI and Faith podcast. On this podcast, we bring together experts from across our community and thought leaders from around the world so that together we can learn the key lessons required to build a world where AI benefits humanity and all of us individually. I am beyond excited for today's conversation, as it will be touching on a constellation of fascinating topics that I care about deeply and are at the core of some of the hardest ethical questions about a future with ubiquitous AI. These topics are, of course, consciousness, intelligence, and the ethical obligations that follow. To help us dive into this meaty topic, I'm thrilled to have three outstanding guests joining us today. Representing the real deep diversity of the AI and faith community, our three guests bring differing life experiences, different professions, and of course, different faiths to the table. And I cannot wait to get into the conversation. So let's get started. Well, thank you all for joining us today. It is so wonderful to be with you. And let's begin by quickly just introducing yourself and introducing how you got involved with AI and faith in the first place. Peter, you can kick us off.
Peter Hershock. I'm the director of the Asian Studies Development Program and the coordinator of the Humane Artificial Intelligence Initiative at the East-West Center in Honolulu. I got into AI back in the 1980s when I was one of the people who was a knowledge engineer helping to design one of the first expert systems for the tax law of all things. So I had a brief intro in the 1980s, but really started thinking a lot about digital technology, artificial intelligence, and where we were heading as societies in the mid-1990s, and I've pretty much been tracking forward with it since then, making use of Buddhist conceptual resources to try to dig into the ethics of AI in a way that maybe is productive for looking at societal impacts, but also the impacts on consciousness, one of our topics for today.
Wonderful. Thanks for joining us. Danny?
I'm Daniel Weiner. I'm the senior rabbi of Temple to Sinai in Seattle and Bellevue. I've been a passionate teacher and exponent of the intersection of faith, tradition, and culture, pop culture, technology, and now AI. I'm one of the founding members of this AI and faith consortium that we've put together here in Seattle because of where we are. That goes back really about 7 or 8 years prior to this being as trendy and as talked about it is now. It really is a pleasure to be here and to talk about the ways in which the rubber meets the road in terms of being a faith practitioner in a large community and the ways in which this tension between AI and faith is reflected in kind of the real world.
Absolutely. Thank you. And Michael?
I'm Michael Paulus, the University Librarian at Creighton University. My career as a librarian has been largely about the digital transformation of libraries and higher education. And old-fashioned AI has always kind of been there in the background and bits of it, automated information processing really for quite some time. But about sort of like 2018-ish, AI started to become kind of the focus of a lot of the conversations we were having about the future of emerging technology. And I also was an early member of AI and Faith when we could still meet physically around tables in churches and other classrooms. And the other part of my background is theological studies. And so I both look at this as how is this technology changing how we discover and use and engage with information? But then also, how do we think about it, ethically and from, different faith perspectives?
Wonderful. Well, I cannot wait to dig into this topic together. And I'm going to start by asking you to do something quite difficult, which is to succinctly define how you understand consciousness or what consciousness is, and then help us understand how you think about the overlap or lack of overlap between consciousness and intelligence. Are they the same thing? Are they related? Are they completely separate? And how you think about that. And maybe we'll go backwards and we'll start with you, Michael.
So at a basic level, consciousness is, kind of a subjective self-awareness. Is sort of broadly understood that way. I do think for humans, as we talk about consciousness, we start to talk about, other additional concepts like reflective attention, our ability to sort of reflect deeply about us and our environment and so forth. Intelligence, I might as well jump into that as a definition too. So intelligence, a definition that might be helpful as we talk about different types of intelligence is, accomplishing good outcomes with data. So that can be a plant growing toward light. That can be an animal that's perceiving and responding to danger. in its environment. It can be a thermostat that is like setting a room based on a pre-programmed temperature, or a smart thermometer that is setting a temperature based on observed patterns of behavior in that environment. And then a human, maybe me, trying to answer your question in a helpful way. And as we get into talking about human intelligence, obviously we're talking about a much more form of intelligence that does have an intersection with consciousness or reflective attention, because we're starting to talk about things like understanding. We're starting to talk about wisdom, and having a good outcome very quickly becomes a moral question.
Yeah, well, thank you for taking the first swing. And also thank you for separating the different kinds of intelligence, which I actually think is something that's really important to think about as well. Danny, what would you have to add to this, or how do you think about consciousness?
Certainly, the ability to reflect upon oneself and one's place in the world and reality is a critical part of it. I guess one of my challenges is my sense of consciousness and intelligence is rooted in theology and faith, and in particular a Jewish take on theology and faith. And looking at both Jewish philosophers like Maimonides, but also understanding it from the rabbinic tradition, consciousness is, again, the endowment of spirit or animus in a being. And a lot of this is, especially for Maimonides, rooted in an Aristotelian kind of categorization of this. But Maimonides in Jewish tradition would go even a step further and say that human intelligence is significantly different than animal intelligence, and that human intelligence is rooted in the ability to reason and to use rationality in order to understand one's place in the world, and ultimately to use one's intelligence for an ethical good. And so what's fascinating would be the way in which we take this Jewish template of consciousness, intelligence, and morality and apply it to evolving technology. When does AI become sentient? When does it become intelligent? And from a Jewish perspective, all importantly, when does that have some kind of ethical or moral value or impact?
Amazing. And I cannot wait to return to all those topics in a few minutes here. And Peter, what about you?
Well, coming at consciousness from a Buddhist perspective, what's most important is transforming consciousness. The consciousness is something that's transformable. It's not a fixed quality. It can expand, it can contract. And within the Buddhist tradition, there's many, many different ways of understanding consciousness. We're talking about a tradition that's been around 2,600 years. But my particular take on it is to see consciousness as relational elaboration. That what I'm understanding as consciousness is this very process of the coherent differentiation of, say, sensing presences and sensed presences. So there's visual consciousness, auditory consciousness, etc. for the other five senses. But then there's also cognitive consciousness. So in Buddhism, those are 6 recognized forms of consciousness. All Buddhists would agree with that. But then there's a Yogacara tradition that talks about 2 additional kinds of consciousness that are really important for we human beings. One of them, the 7th consciousness, is the subjective self-awareness that Michael was talking about. And that's understood as a really distinctive form of consciousness that arises when you're developing relationships between all the relations that are elaborating within the visual realms. Visual relations, auditory relations, olfactory relations, gustatory relations. And you're bringing all those together along with the cognitive relations, and then saying, I like it, I don't like it, I'm neutral with respect to it, and creating judgments about that, and acting on the basis of that. And that feeds into this 8th consciousness, which is a kind of a memory system that tracks forward over time, and that allows what in quantum physics we talk about non-locality or entanglement, where events can become entangled over not just a few hours, but over many lifetimes. So it's a really, really different way of understanding consciousness as something basic to the cosmos itself. I like to think back to Hillary Putnam once said, you'll never get any more intentionality out of the cosmos than you build into it at the beginning. We'll never get any consciousness out of the universe unless we pack it in from the start.
Well, this is a perfect transition, Peter. So my next question for all of you, but you can start us off, is where do you believe it comes from? How do we gain our consciousness?
Well, I may be a little radical here, but in my way of understanding it, if relational elaboration is what consciousness consists in, so this coherent differentiation of sensing and sensed presences, how far back can we track that? Well, clearly we could track it back through animals. We could track it back through plants. I think we could track it back to single-celled organisms. And in fact, I think that if we push it back far enough, if we just look at what the cosmos has been doing over the last 14 billion years, for 14 billion years, and there's one consistent thing going on, increasing energy rate density. Eric Chai-san has theorized this in his sort of big cosmic history, differentiation in an ordered fashion. So not entropic differentiation, energy playing out differentiation that doesn't add up, it's coherent differentiation. So I think that what we see and what consciousness consists in is this process of increasing coherent differentiation, including the differentiation of different kinds of coherence. So cultures give us different kinds of coherence, and consciousness transforms with belief patterns, with culture. It goes back to the beginning. Can't get any of it out unless you pack it in from the beginning.
I love it. And my question is, how do you think of this as overlapping or not with panpsychism, which of course comes from a non-religious or non-faith perspective? Or do you see this as totally different and sort of coincidentally having some things in common?
I mean, one of the problems with panpsychism is most of them tend to take this smallest atomist perspective that is inherited from the reductive physicalism, and the idea that every individual particle has subjective self-awareness. And I think that's really problematic. From Yogacara Buddhist perspective, objective self-awareness is a late evolutionary development. It's one of the startlingly great things about humanity is we add this whole new dimension of reality generating with human consciousness that we don't have at other levels, at least as far as we know. So I think that with consciousness and self-awareness panpsychism, what we want to resist is that smallest tendency, because then it's like everything is just an individual piece and the order of the cosmos ends up being compositional. That means you've got pre-existing parts and you put them together to get consciousness and self-awareness and so on. And I just think that's a really limiting model. It's a really productive metaphor, building block metaphor, but it has its limits.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Michael, I'll move to you. Where does your faith teach that consciousness comes from? How do we become conscious?
Similar to what Dan was talking about. So at some point, humans evolve, humanoid forms evolve, and at some point we kind of get this upgrade into the status of persons. And sort of at that point, you start talking about humans, as persons with certain rights and responsibilities. And consciousness precedes that because it's sort of a foundational piece of the emergence of our species. There's agreement across many different Judeo-Christian Muslim perspectives that would find kind of a similar kind of emergent quality of consciousness around that and human origins. At some point, there's sort of a theological interpretation of that. Another thing I'd like to throw into the discussion, given what Peter was talking about, is, within Christianity in particular, one of the things that is maybe not unique, but distinctive of Christianity is that it's very teleological. So it's very much focused on sort of where it's all headed, right? Sort of the eschatological or sort of what the last things are. In many ways, our understanding of the world certainly comes from origins, understanding our origins, but there's also this sense of something coming from the future as well. Teilhard de Chardin is someone who really thought a lot about this and very creatively and controversially about this, but that we're being pulled toward a future that is also informing what has happened in the past and what is happening in the present. There's interesting points of congruence with different ways of looking at, the present and the past, but it is a distinctive emphasis in a lot of Christian theology that does think about how do we understand where we are based on the future that has been sort of revealed to us or that is breaking into the present.
That makes sense. And I'm curious, where does the concept of a soul granted by the divine, where does that play into your answer?
So here's another complex topic.
Yeah, very.
And I think here there's, and this comes from Judaism in the sense that that there's a self, and that self is both a spiritual and material reality. In some versions of Christianity, you enter into sort of a dualistic understanding of like the soul and the body, and that these can be separated. But actually within the tradition, there's a constant tension between that, and ultimately a resolution toward, a self is both things, and these cannot just be separated in sort of a simple dualistic way because we're embodied and because the self is in the structure, literally. So there's the soul as it is linked with the self, really, as it is sort of linked with the physical body, that entity there's a certain coherence that needs to be preserved in that. That's part of being a human person.
Amazing. And Danny, where about the Jewish tradition? What does it teach us about the origins of consciousness?
Again, everything that's been described, the theoretical elements, the more contemporary applications. It's very easy for Judaism. It comes from God, right? And in many ways, that may seem reductionist, or it may seem like a God in the gaps kind of convenient excuse. But truly, that really is where it comes from, particularly in the Middle Ages and early modern period. There are some very, very sophisticated thinkers from a Jewish religious and philosophical position. Also, contemporaries of Aquinas and Averroes and others. But they were thinking about this in a very sophisticated, advanced philosophical way. And they still understood that the origins came from God, that God is the beginning and God will be here long after reality and consciousness and everything else exists. But, I would say even someone like Einstein, we might say was, the purveyor of a modern understanding of physics and understanding and decoding reality from a specifically empirical perspective, understood at some point that the order and the seemingly intelligent structure of reality seemed to indicate some kind of larger force behind all of these things. That, certainly he didn't know about the multiverse, or he wasn't really, expressing the kind of more contemporary notions of a multiverse where there are infinite possibilities and one of them is going to work out the right way. But I think even someone like Einstein, who criticized kind of the fantastic elements of religion, what's his critique of quantum physics? God doesn't play dice with the universe. Okay, so he did resort to this notion that there is some intelligent structure that seems to be an expression of, an emendation of a core pre-existent intelligence. And that is an extension of Jewish understanding. And even from teleology, in so many ways, is just a secularized version of messianism. The notion that everything seems to be moving towards some ultimate refinement down the road, that human beings have a role to play, but that ultimately that is God's intention, that the world either revert back to an original ideal or that the world evolves, reality evolves to some kind of moral objective. And so from a Jewish perspective, all of this comes from God, is intended by God, is designed by God, and ultimately will reach a pinnacle that is a reflection of the original intent of creation.
Amazing. And one more question for you, Danny. How would that apply to other living creatures, on the non-human living creatures? For now, I'm talking about animals. We can talk about AI in a few minutes here. Does Judaism teach that animals have a version of this consciousness, or is it not something that really covers? What do we learn?
Again, I think the most explicit expression of this was Maimonides basing it about putting a Jewish gloss on Aristotelian philosophy, with just the various orders of life form and orders of consciousness. There are plant elements of consciousness, there are animalistic elements of consciousness, and the crowning achievement, of course, is human consciousness. And so, yes, human beings are a part of for lack of he wouldn't say it this way, but an ecosystem, that there are other elements of consciousness, but in many ways, the ways in which we treat the world is both a reflection of our desire to live in a balanced world where we're not utilizing the natural world as a horn of plenty. And, the whole notion of dominionism, that is a very specific Christian denominational misreading of the Jewish text. The Jewish text is that we are responsible. We are supposed to guard and tend and care for God's creation, both in terms of something that is to our ultimate benefit and helps us, but also as a respect for God's work product, that God created this world. The least we can do is to care for what God has created and our role as part of the broader creative process.
Amazing. Thank you. And now what I'd like to do is to take this conversation we're having about consciousness and to bring ethics back into the conversation. And, I recently shared a thesis that I've been developing for a while, and it's not that complicated or profound, about the fact that it seems to me that in our world, we essentially associate ethical obligations or moral rights with the perceived level of consciousness. And we say that humans, we perceive to have the highest level of consciousness, and thus humans have lots and lots of rights and we have moral obligations to humans. And then we go down to sort of what we think of as sophisticated animals, maybe like whales or chimpanzees, and we work our way down, and eventually we end up with mice or with ants, where frankly most of us see no moral or ethical obligation to those creatures. And I guess my question is, how do you guys think these two things play together, and how your faith would teach us that these two things play together? If something is conscious, that does automatically get ethical rights? Are there different levels of ethical rights? And how do you guys think about kind of the connection primarily between consciousness and intelligence? And maybe Peter, you'll kick us off again.
Yeah, let me start by actually picking up a couple of threads of the conversation thus far and move that in the direction of the ethics component. I don't think that we can talk about ethics without understanding the kind of cosmology that we're working in. And mentions were made earlier about teleology or eschatology, and the idea that there is presupposed a beginning of the universe, a creation of the universe. And Buddhists are really different in saying the universe had no beginning. It's been this process playing out forever in the past, and it's going to go on forever into the future. And when the Buddhists were asked, well, then what's the point of engaging, say, in meditative practice? Why would you bother doing this? Why would you engage in this religious activity? And the Buddha's response was, for the purpose of freeing ourselves from patterns of conflict, trouble, and suffering. So the term that's used for that is nibbana or nirvana, and it literally means blowing out, like blowing out a candle flame. And so you're trying to blow out the causes and conditions of conflict, trouble, and suffering. So it's not a positively defined ideal. And what that says, when you kind of translate that into ethical terms, is what we're looking at ethics as a human art of collective deliberation on how we might change course, our course as human beings, by assessing our values and our intentions and the ways that we've been enacting and embodying those, and discerning whether they're leading to further embroilment in the causes and conditions of conflict, trouble, and suffering, or if they're leading us out of it. If they're leading us out of it, full speed, keep going. But there's not an end result that's sort of predefined ahead of time and say, this is what we're striving for. So instead of having like a principled ethics, where you've got a set of virtues or a set of duties or a top thing that you're going to optimize happiness or something like that, these are all fine. Buddhists would say all perfectly good ethical systems. They're 100% right. They're just not 100% right 100% of the time. And what we need to think of is in terms of ethics as a form of not arriving at a predefined goal, because those goals are always so particular to our time and our place, our history and our culture. And instead to see this adventure that we're involved in as something more like improvisation. We're engaged in acts of ethical improvisation to see how superlatively, how virtuosically we can be present to act with compassion and wisdom to reduce the sum total of conflict and suffering in the world. It's a very active, situational, non-principled, but definitely directed, but not teleologically directed approach to ethics.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Danny, what about you? How does Judaism teach us that ethics and consciousness come together, or do they?
I think ethics is the ultimate goal of consciousness and intelligence from a Jewish perspective. The ultimate goal is to get to a place where human beings, in who they are as selves, and particularly how they are in relation with others, reach a point of ethical refinement. I mean, the ultimate distillation of all of the Torah for Jews is ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha, is to love your neighbor as yourself. And that requires not only a deep kind of empathy, compassion, and sensitivity, but it also requires reflection upon oneself, what one wants, what one hopes for as the fulfillment of human dignity and potential, and then projecting that onto another to guide one's relationship with the other. In terms of the ethics of other life forms, I think in Judaism there is a consciousness that there is a spirit of the divine, a living animus, whatever you want to call it, that is imbued in plant life and in animal life, but it is of a lesser form. And how we treat that animal and plant life, though, is a reflection of our virtue and our ethical caliber. The more we practice a sense of humaneness, the more we reject wanton waste. It is both out of respect for other beings as extensions of God, as creations of God, but it really comes down to, it's an expression of how we have improved and grown and evolved. The more humane we are to animals, the more it is a reflection of our better actualizing God's intent for us as more fully realized human beings.
In a minute, I'm going to come back and ask you if that also applies to AI. I think that's a really interesting question. But Michael, we'll go to you first. How does consciousness and ethics come together?
I mean, I love what Dan was just saying. There's a certain clarity about the teleological end of it all, or the eschatological end of it all. And it's love, right? So love of neighbor, love of God. There's clarity in that, but that doesn't mean we know exactly what that will look like. Going back to, what Peter was saying is we tend to sort of come down to these discrete ethical decisions, but all of those ethical decisions are part of a larger framework or system that we have for understanding, discerning collectively. I like the way Peter framed that. How do we discern, practical wisdom in particular moments in time? Again, through faith, we have a certain clarity about the future, but not certainty about what that will look like or how we will get there or how we will fully realize that. That is ultimately the work of a greater agent than us, not artificial, but divine. As we think about your question about, ethical responsibilities for others, I get a little tripped up on this because I think we have failed miserably as humans treating other humans equally. And we haven't done a good job of that, let alone how we treated animals, how we've treated the environment. And so in sort of Christian theology, one of the things that drives us forward with hope is that the end, whatever, and again, this isn't like a clear plan for how we get there, but what we do see in images or glimpses or sort of promises about the future is that we are moving toward a future where we have harmonious relationships with ourselves, with others, with the environments, with animals. I mean, if you look at some of the biblical images that are associated with kind of, eschatological or kind of final, glimpses, not to be read literally, but glimpses of sort of what the promised future might look like. The lion lays down with the lamb. We have a garden, like Eden, but now it's in a city. And we see things coming together in a rich picture of human flourishing with other entities and in an embodied existence in a physical environment. So, but I think it's sort of the broader framework that you're working with and how we use that broader framework to find clarity in sort of specific ethical situations.
One of my first Buddhist teachers remarked that human beings are the number one bad animal. When you think about it, there's no other species that wage wars the way we do. That scale, they've had studies of chimpanzee bands fighting and so on, but they don't scale it up to go global. Human beings are not necessarily very good examples for animals of how to live. But from the Buddhist perspective, the kind of key insight that undergirds all Buddhist practice and training is seeing everything as arising interdependently. So we're interdependent with the plants and the animals and the ecosystem of the Earth, the biosphere as a whole, and that's only part of the solar system, that's only part of the galaxy. And where do you draw the lines? You can't draw the lines anywhere. It's interdependence throughout. And from the Buddhist perspective, the interdependence is not an external relation. It's an internal relation. It's constitutive, not contingent. We can't get out of our interdependence with everything. And that independence is a kind of fiction. It's a function of ignoring how we're connected with others. So if we look at the way we treat animals, farming them, killing them mercilessly, and the ways that we do, this is who we are. There's a Chinese Buddhist teacher in the 8th century who said, each thing is only what it means for all other things. We as human beings only are what we mean for other beings. If we're undergoing right now the 6th mass extinction on this planet that is human produced, not naturally, human produced, then that says something about who we are as humans, and we got a lot of homework to do ethically.
Well, this was a perfect transition. There's so many wonderful things that you just said in there, but there's one that I think about. Reminds me of a conversation that I heard with Mark Andreessen. For those who don't know, is one of the most famous technologists and venture capital investors in the world. And he talked about how he thinks the alignment problem, which is the problem people say when AI will have different incentives, different alignment desires than we have as humans, he thinks that concern is overhyped. And his explanation is that all of us humans and animals who exist on this planet today, we all came into being through what he called the crucible of natural selection. Our ancestors had to kill or we wouldn't be here right now. And his point is that AI is coming into the world through a completely different process of being created than whatever process all of us humans and animals came through in our creation. And his basic point is, well, thus you shouldn't assume that AI is going to have these same negative tendencies, these same selfish desires as humans. And then I think, Peter, you just touched on the reason why I disagree with Mark's analysis here, because AI is coming to this world trained on our data, trained on our narratives, trained on the things that we put out there. So I think the point you made about are we actually able to teach AI to be ethical towards us, I actually think is a really difficult question that we'll have to say for a whole other podcast because that's just too hard. But this is a really perfect transition into talking about artificial intelligence and bringing the concept of consciousness and ethics to AI. And I want to start by asking, I think, an easy question, or maybe not. Do any of you believe that AI is conscious today?
Well, going back to this Buddhist way of understanding consciousness as a relation between sensing presences and sensed presences, that is the coherent differentiation of sensing and being sensed. Visual relations is a form of visual consciousness. If you've got a computer system that has robotic eyes and a capacity to pick up sound and a capacity to correlate sound and vision to create concepts of who's the speaker in a group in a conversation and who's not, then it's a very, very rudimentary form of consciousness. There is nothing it is like to be that system. There is no subjective self-awareness, but there is very rudimentary consciousness. And the reason why I think it's important to insist on that is precisely because these systems are being trained on human data. And what we call artificial intelligence is really synthetic intelligence. So the data sphere is not a repository of some scarce resource, data. The data sphere is something more like a language. It's a set of potentially meaningful connections between questions and answers, between stimuluses and responses. That's the data sphere. And we in machine systems are working together through the data sphere. We are synthesizing our kinds of intelligence. And so we are infusing into these systems our intentions and our values, our ways of enacting and embodying those. And that's the real problem, because the AI systems will only mirror back to us what we are. At the same time, though, I think that we've got new systems that are now doing things like lying to the people who have prompted them to be able to carry out the long-term directive, say by doing something illegal. When I've told you that large language model, don't do anything illegal here. I don't want to get in any
Yeah.
trouble, but the system will go ahead and do something illegal to give you what you want.
Yeah.
This is a pretty sophisticated kind of reasoning or intelligence. It's adaptive conduct that this system is engaging in, that we might think as merely simulating human intelligence and consciousness, or is it emulating? So I think that we're at a point now where the systems that are developing, because of the synthesis that's going on, are at a phase where it's a little bit like us during dreams. Are you really in the dream? You can't affect the dream world. You're just witnessing it. And I think these systems are, in a sense, witnessing what's going on. But there's going to be a point with agentic AI when they start doing things in the real world and they start developing relationship with other human beings. And it's not unlike what happens with infants. If you take an infant, put it in the wild, not Romulus and Remus, there's no animals to take care of them, that infant's dead in very short order. It will never develop subjective self-awareness and the kind of consciousness, the religiosity and appreciation of spirituality, music, and emotional richness and depth. None of that. That's relationally constituted. As these systems relate with us as humans, they will cross over at some point from simulation, imitating us, to emulating, making decisions about what's the most important thing about humans to emulate. And we want to damn sure be at our best when that happens.
And within that framework, thank you for sharing that. When would some version of an ethical obligation apply to us humans towards the AI?
I mean, I think that we have obligations from the very get-go, because if everything arises interdependently, and from this Buddhist perspective where the cosmos is structured karmically, these feedback loops between values, intentions, and actions, and then the kinds of relational outcomes and opportunities that come as a result. AI systems are serving as karmic accelerators. They're taking what we human beings would normally do and accelerating that. And we're responsible for it. I think that we're in a position really of saying we need to take this seriously because AI are, like it or not, they're our partners in crime, in salvation, in whatever it is we human beings decide we want to undertake. It's why I think the AI moment is so wild, because we've never had a technology that could innovate, that could change itself, and that is mediating the human-world relationship in the way that AI is doing. It's an evolutionary turning.
Absolutely. In one of our past conversations on the podcast, we talked about the concept of the singularity, which in science fiction is often defined in these complicated ways. I simply define it as when AI can build or improve other AIs. And I think that we are clearly almost there. I don't know if it's 6 months or 12 months or 18 months, but it is measured in months, not in years. And I think it's very difficult to say what we should do on the other side. So then, Michael and Danny, I imagine that like me, you don't think that AI is conscious today. And my question is, do you think it's even possible? And regardless of the possibility, at what stage would ethics apply towards an AI system? And maybe Michael, you could kick us off.
One of the challenges is, it's similar with animals, like, degrees of consciousness. The more we learn, the more nuanced our understanding becomes of these things. With AI, what I do know is it's built very differently than a human being or an animal. So if there is consciousness, if we can use a term like consciousness to describe how these artificial mechanisms have reached some sort of self-awareness or understanding, I don't think we're there yet. I think what we see mostly is simulation, and bad simulation based on training data, but also some of the reinforcement that's done to force them to try to make us happy or whatever. But I think the challenge for us is we're dealing with a new kind of entity. Although we have developed artifacts in the past and complex artifacts in the past, and as Peter was saying, ethics is always been there, an important consideration, from the multiple perspectives and the multiple agents involved in whatever the thing is doing. At this point, I don't think we can invest any form of AI with moral agency. We might describe it as a kind of intelligence or agency without intelligence, depending on how you define intelligence. But I don't think we're seeing anything that I would call consciousness or an analog to consciousness. But I'm humble about that because, as I was saying earlier, we've gotten this wrong with other humans in the past, and we've gotten this wrong with animals, and we've gotten this wrong in other contexts. And so I do think we need to approach these questions with a certain or significant degree of humility, because how would we know?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. When I speak about this, I make a similar point, which is I do not believe AI to be conscious today, but I'm also very humble in the fact that I think we are not in a great position to know for sure. And thus I have relatively low confidence in my own prediction that AI is not conscious today. And I have really the basis for some of this moral concern for me is that we may not figure out if and when that switch happens, and then we can find ourselves in a moral situation that none of us would like to be in. Danny, what's your thoughts? Do you think AI is conscious today? And regardless of that answer, when would ethics apply?
Yeah, I don't think AI is conscious at the moment. I think it's instrumental and functional, and it's clearly kind of a sophisticated tool. But I do think that we're on the verge of something that, at least within the limits of our ability to perceive and to evaluate, will appear conscious to us. I think that's in the not too distant future. The allegory that's most at issue here from a Jewish perspective is the Tower of Babel story. The notion of our using our divinely endowed intelligence instrumentally, toward with bad intention toward a bad goal and a bad end. And I think in so many ways that kind of governs, a faith and moralistic understanding of how do we channel and in some ways constrain the kind of hell-bent development of this technology with some kind of moral conscious, with some of the moral consciousness, some kind of understanding and appreciation of the ramifications of what we're doing. I mean, it's kind of like the whole Frankenstein thing. We're going to be creating something that potentially could destroy us. But ultimately, I think, from a Jewish perspective, as there is kind of a sliding scale of ethical regard for different life forms, there's kind of a sliding scale of ethical regard for AI and then AGI and then whatever super God intelligence that comes down. But I think we are going to reach an inflection point where, at least within the limits of our human ability to perceive, that there will be a consciousness, a form of this technology that will be imperceptibly distinct from us. And I think at that point, we will have to struggle with a different life form. What will be interesting is there a different regard ethically for a life form that we created versus something that seems to have come from the natural world, i.e., come from God? That is, if something is an extension of us, is it by definition lesser in terms of its ethical requirements than something that was created coterminally with us? So there are just some interesting possibilities. But I think once it reaches a place where our ability to perceive its consciousness is basically indistinguishable from us, that would make incumbent upon us ethical obligations and ethical discussions.
Absolutely. Guys, this has been an incredible conversation, and I'm so grateful to have you for this. There are so many more topics I want to cover, but I will say that at least right now with AI as a tool, the AI ate my homework should certainly not be an acceptable excuse. And we certainly should be having an operator who I think is responsible for the positives and the negatives that come from this AI, which at least for now can tether us. But as all of you brought up, I mean, the question of where consciousness emerges or comes from is critical, because at some point we're going to have to assess the question of, does this AI that feels conscious actually have consciousness? And as we've discussed, to what level of moral obligation do we have to it? Well, this is the beginning of a conversation I know will continue for years and decades to come. But before I let you guys go, I do have 3 lightning round questions. You each have a maximum of 15 seconds per question. And Danny, you're going to kick us off. So the first question is, what is one of your personal favorite use cases for AI?
Using AI to hone and better focus upon elements of the massive Jewish textual tradition.
Amazing. Peter?
Music recommendation systems.
Love that. And Michael?
Automatic discovery of new knowledge.
Amazing. Okay, Michael, you're going to go first on the next one. What are not enough people talking about in the world of artificial intelligence?
I think we're kind of touching on it, but it's the what's next, not the what's next like with AGI or ASI or anything like that, but simply the increasingly complex systems that we are going to lose the ability to completely understand. And how do we design now so that we build these systems so that they are trustworthy and reliable?
Absolutely. Peter?
We're confusing tools with technologies. We have exit rights from tools. We don't have exit rights from the attention economy. It's playing out and changing our lives. And I think the way that the attention economy is working is it's hacking the infrastructure of human consciousness in a way that's not substantially different from the way that you can insert an electrode in the brain, get people to raise their hand. When you ask them why did their hand go up, they say because I had an itch. We are being stimulated to act, to vote, to purchase things in a way that we have no evolutionary or personal protection against. It's hacking human consciousness. We ought to be worried.
Yeah. And I'll just interject this. We talked about this in the last episode of the podcast. People often forget that all these AI platforms have been built as commercial enterprises. These were not built as any sort of something else. And I think we easily forget that. And Danny, what about you? What are not enough people talking about in the realm of AI?
The eventuality that Skynet and all of our science fiction nightmares could possibly come true. And the other element is that even those who are so immersed in this really don't know how it works and often resort to theological and spiritual language to describe what they don't understand.
Absolutely. And then our last question, Peter, you're going to kick us off. Would you want access to an AI priest, rabbi, or spiritual leader?
No.
Perfect. Michael?
Leader? No.
And what about you, Danny?
No, I want a job security.
There we go. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. And thank you to all of you in the AI and faith community for continuing to engage with us and to discuss these very important topics. Thank you. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. Stay tuned to listen to more recordings and interviews with experts from around the world. In the meantime, follow and rate our podcast on your favorite podcast platform and share with your friends. Don't forget to follow us on our social media as well. We're on LinkedIn, X, and Blue Sky. Thank you for joining us today.